The morning was bitter cold. Snow covered the rolling hills of the Ardennes. It was December 16th, 1944. In the dark forests of Belgium, the quiet was broken by distant artillery fire. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Hitler's last great offensive in the West was underway. More than 200,000 German troops pushed through the fog and snow, aiming to split the Allied lines. If successful, they would capture Antwerp and force the Allies to negotiate peace. But in a small Belgian village called Lanzerath, something extraordinary happened. A single American reconnaissance squad, just 18 men, held off nearly 500 German paratroopers for 18 long hours. This is their story, a story of courage, confusion, and an impossible stand. The squad belonged to the 99th Infantry Division, known as the Checkerboard Division. Its intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, the I&R Platoon, was led by Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr., only 20 years old. Most of his men were teenagers, some were still fresh out of high school. They weren't frontline infantry. They were scouts and observers, trained to gather information, not to hold ground. Yet on that frozen December morning, fate placed them directly in the path of an entire German battalion. Bouck's platoon had been ordered to occupy a ridge near Lanzerath, a tiny Belgian village overlooking a key road that led to the Elsenborn Ridge, one of the Allies' vital defensive lines. They dug in among pine trees and snowdrifts, setting up foxholes and observation posts. The men thought it was a quiet sector. Even their commanders believed no major attack would come there. They were wrong. For several days before December 16th, Bouck's platoon reported strange activity. They heard trucks moving at night. They spotted lights deep in the forest. Something was coming. Bouck radioed his superiors, warning them that enemy troops might be massing in the woods. But the higher-ups dismissed his concerns. They thought he was mistaken, maybe seeing local patrols or supply movements. The front line was supposed to be quiet. The Ardennes was considered a rest area for tired units. But Bouck trusted his instincts. He ordered his men to improve their foxholes, strengthen their positions, and stockpile ammunition. On the evening of December 15th, they checked their rifles, loaded magazines, and waited. The snow kept falling. The forest was silent. They had no idea that by morning they would face one of the most lopsided fights of the war. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the entire front erupted. Artillery thundered across the Ardennes. German shells rained down on Allied positions for miles. Bouck's men were jolted awake as explosions echoed through the valley. They crouched in their foxholes, gripping their rifles. Then came the sound, the unmistakable clanking of tank treads and the shouts of German voices. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Bouck's platoon didn't know it yet, but they were facing elements of Kampfgruppe Piper, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and Fallschirmjäger Regiment 9, German paratroopers known for their toughness and discipline. The Germans' mission was clear. Break through the thin American lines, seize key bridges, and drive west before the Allies could react. The small village of Lanzerath sat right in their path. By mid-morning, Bouck's men could see movement across the snowy fields. Figures in grey-green uniforms appeared among the trees. German paratroopers were advancing, cautiously, in formation. Bouck watched through binoculars. He counted hundreds, He couldn't believe it. "Hold your fire," he whispered. He wanted the enemy to come closer. The Germans didn't know they were facing a full platoon. They believed only a few American outposts guarded the ridge. They had no idea that every foxhole on that slope was manned and ready. At around 8:30 a.m., Bouck gave the command. Fire. The ridge erupted in gunfire. M1 rifles cracked, machine guns rattled. The snow around the Germans exploded with dirt and blood. Caught in the open, the paratroopers dropped to the ground, seeking cover. They hadn't expected such fierce resistance. The Americans, hidden and camouflaged, fired with deadly accuracy. Within minutes, German squads were pinned down. For the next hour, the battle raged across the ridge. Every time the Germans tried to move forward, they were cut down by precise rifle fire. Bouck's men fought like veterans. They worked in pairs, covering each other's reloads, conserving ammunition. Private Preston and Sergeant Pitts manned the machine gun, cutting down advancing paratroopers who tried to flank their line. By mid-morning, dozens of Germans lay wounded or dead in the snow. The German commander, Major Günther Stangenberg of the 9th Parachute Regiment, was furious. He had lost men to what he thought was a minor American patrol. He ordered his troops to pull back, reorganize, and attack again. Bouck's platoon used the lull to resupply from captured ammunition boxes and reposition their guns. They knew the Germans would be back. Inside the foxholes, frost-bitten fingers trembled. Some men whispered prayers. Others checked their rifles again and again. Bouck crawled from hole to hole, encouraging his men. "Stay low. Don't waste rounds. Make every shot count." The young lieutenant knew they were badly outnumbered, 18 against hundreds. But he also knew the terrain favored them. The ridge gave them a perfect line of fire. The Germans had to cross open ground to reach them. By late morning, the Germans attacked again. This time, they brought mortars and machine guns. Shells burst among the trees, showering the Americans with splinters of wood and snow. The noise was deafening. Bouck's men huddled in their foxholes as explosions ripped the forest apart. Then came the shouting, "Los! Vorwärts!" The Germans charged. Through the smoke, paratroopers sprinted up the slope. Some carried submachine guns, others threw grenades. But once again, the Americans held their fire until the enemy was close. Then they unleashed another deadly volley. German soldiers fell by the dozen. Those who made it halfway up the ridge dove for cover, pinned down once more. From his command post, Bouck spotted a machine gun nest forming near a farmhouse. He called to Sergeant Slape, the platoon's marksman. Slape lined up his rifle and fired. One shot, then another. The machine gun went silent. The Germans were stunned. Every move they made seemed anticipated. They began to suspect they were facing an entire American company. But it was still just Bouck's 18 men. By noon, the situation grew tense. Bouck realized they could be surrounded. Radio contact with headquarters was poor. Their calls for reinforcements went unanswered. The nearest American units, the 394th Infantry and elements of the 2nd Division, were miles away, struggling to understand the scope of the German attack. Bouck decided they would hold as long as possible. Every hour they delayed, the enemy bought precious time for the U.S. Army to react. He told his men, "We stay until we can't." They nodded. No one argued. The young Americans were cold, exhausted, and scared, but determined. By early afternoon, a strange silence fell over Lanzerath Ridge. Smoke drifted between the trees. The snow was stained with blood. Bouck peeked over the edge of his foxhole. He could see German medics dragging wounded men away. Bodies littered the field in front of their position. The Americans were running low on ammunition. Each man counted his remaining clips carefully. Grenades were nearly gone. Private Lyle Buddy Milburn looked to his squad leader and asked quietly, "How long you think we can keep this up?" Sergeant Pitts replied, "As long as we have to." They all knew what that meant. At around 2 p.m., the Germans tried a new tactic. They used smoke grenades to cover a flanking maneuver from the woods. This time, they sent smaller teams to probe the American line from the sides. Bouck realized what was happening and quickly shifted his men. He repositioned the machine gun and ordered overlapping fields of fire. When the Germans appeared from the right flank, they were met with a wall of bullets. 2 paratroopers dropped instantly. The rest scattered into the trees. On the left, a squad tried to sneak up through a gully. Private Sam Jenkins spotted movement and fired 3 quick shots. 2 Germans fell. The rest retreated. The snow muffled the sounds, but the fight was brutal and close. Some attackers got within 50 yards of the American line before being stopped. By 3 p.m., the third assault had failed. Major Stangenberg couldn't believe it. Hours had passed, and his battalion was still stuck outside a single ridge defended by fewer than 20 Americans. He was under pressure from his superiors to move forward. Every delay risked ruining the entire timetable of the offensive. He ordered artillery to shell the ridge. Explosions tore through the forest. Trees splintered, and snow burst into clouds of white. Bouck's men hugged the frozen ground, praying their luck would hold. After the bombardment, the Germans tried once more to advance, but the Americans still fired back. Every time the paratroopers thought they had broken through, they met another burst from the hidden foxholes. By now, the German soldiers were nervous. Some refused to move forward. They whispered to each other that the Americans must have machine guns everywhere. They imagined a whole company dug in, waiting. They had no idea it was just a handful of exhausted scouts. By 4 p.m., the winter sun began to fade. The snow turned grey and the forest grew darker. The Germans decided to wait for nightfall. They would attack again under cover of darkness. Bouck knew the night would bring new danger. Without artillery or air support, his men were on their own. He crawled to each foxhole, checking on his soldiers. Some were wounded. One man had shrapnel in his leg. Another had frostbite on his hands. But all refused to leave their posts. The lieutenant shared what little food they had, frozen chocolate bars and cold coffee. He told his men, "We've done our job. Whatever happens next, remember that." They had held the ridge for nearly 12 hours already. As darkness fell, the Germans made their final push. Hundreds of paratroopers moved silently through the snow. They used the trees for cover, creeping closer. Bouck's men could hear footsteps crunching. The sound of whispered German orders drifted through the cold air. Suddenly flares burst overhead, bathing the forest in pale light. The Americans opened fire again. Tracer rounds streaked across the night. But the Germans kept coming. They crawled through ditches, flanked the machine gun nest, and began to surround the position. Bouck realized they were outnumbered beyond hope. He tried to call for help again, but the radio was dead. The Germans launched grenades into the foxholes. Explosions lit up the snow. The Americans fought back fiercely, firing until their rifles clicked empty. One by one, their positions were overrun. By 8 p.m., Bouck was wounded and nearly unconscious. German soldiers surrounded his foxhole. He knew the fight was over. He shouted for his men to surrender before anyone else was killed. One by one, the survivors stood up, hands raised. They were captured, bruised, frostbitten, and exhausted. When the Germans finally took stock of the battlefield, they were stunned. They found only 18 Americans. 18 men had held off nearly 500 elite German paratroopers for an entire day. Dozens of German soldiers lay dead or wounded in the snow. Their advance had been delayed by almost 18 hours, a delay that allowed U.S. forces to regroup and reinforce the Elsenborn Ridge, stopping the German offensive in that sector completely. Bouck's platoon had changed the course of the battle. The captured Americans were marched through the snow to the rear. They were shivering, hungry, and exhausted, but even as prisoners, they were treated with a measure of respect. Some German officers reportedly asked, "How many more of you were there?" Bouck replied, "Just us." The Germans shook their heads in disbelief. For weeks, the platoon remained in captivity until they were liberated in 1945. When they returned, few people knew what they had done. Their reports were lost amid the chaos of the war. It would take decades before their heroism was recognized. After the war, historians studying the Battle of the Bulge discovered the small, almost forgotten skirmish near Lanzerath. They realized that Bouck's platoon had delayed one of the key spearheads of Hitler's last offensive. Had the Germans broken through earlier, they might have reached Elsenborn Ridge before the Americans could organize. That single delay, caused by 18 men, changed the timing of the entire German attack. In 1981, nearly 40 years later, the men of the 394 I&R Platoon were finally recognized. Every member received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award for a unit's collective heroism in combat. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck received the Silver Star. Many of his men received Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. Their stand became known as the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge. It remains one of the most extraordinary examples of courage in U.S. military history. The story of Lanzerath Ridge isn't just about numbers. It's about belief. 18 young men, far from home, stood their ground against impossible odds. They didn't have tanks. They didn't have artillery. They had only their rifles, courage, and trust in one another. For 18 hours, they changed the course of history. And when asked later how they managed it, Bouck simply said, "We were doing our job." For the German soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division and Fallschirmjäger Regiment 9, the offensive into Belgium began before dawn on December 16, 1944. They moved through the dark pine forests of the Ardennes in near silence. Engines were cut off at intervals to avoid detection. Men marched through snowdrifts that reached their knees. It was bitterly cold, -10 degrees Celsius. Breath turned to ice on their scarves. They were confident, even excited. Many had been told this operation would turn the war around. Propaganda leaflets promised that the Americans were soft and inexperienced. Berlin's generals believed that the surprise attack would send the Allies reeling. But by nightfall on that first day, those same German troops would be whispering in disbelief about what had happened at Lanzerath Ridge, about the 18 Americans who stopped a battalion. Major Günther Stangenberg, commander of the 3rd Battalion, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 9, received his orders on December 15th. His unit would lead the advance toward Bullingen, capturing key crossroads to open the way for SS armor behind them. Stangenberg's paratroopers were experienced. Some had fought in Italy and Normandy. They were elite troops, disciplined, confident, and proud of their record. At dawn, they reached the edge of Lanzerath, a small farming village near the Belgian-German border. They expected scattered resistance, perhaps a few outposts. Their intelligence reports said the sector was quiet, lightly held. Then, just after 8 a.m., the first shots came from the ridge above. Corporal Josef Schneider, one of Stangenberg's men, later recalled. "We thought it was a small patrol, maybe 5 or 6 men. We moved across the open field. Suddenly, machine gun fire cut through us. Men fell immediately. We had no idea where the shots came from. The Americans were invisible. They had dug deep into the snow and camouflaged themselves perfectly. Every muzzle flash was hidden. Every movement was precise." Schneider remembered diving behind a fence post. He saw his platoon leader lying in the snow, not moving. Around him, the ground was littered with grey coats and white snow-stained red. It took minutes for the Germans to realize they were in serious trouble. Reports began filtering back to Stangenberg's command post. His forward platoons were pinned down by heavy American resistance. Radio operators couldn't locate the enemy positions. Machine gun bursts came from 3 directions at once. The paratroopers had trained for assaulting fortified positions, but this was different. They didn't know how many Americans were on the ridge, and the snow and fog distorted the sound of gunfire, making the defenders seem more numerous than they were. By mid-morning, the German battalion had lost precious time. They were supposed to secure Lanzerath by 10 a.m. and continue west. Instead, they were stuck in a deadly stalemate. At 10:30 a.m., a motorcycle courier arrived from regimental headquarters. He demanded to know why the advance had stopped. Stangenberg replied bluntly, "We are facing a strong enemy position on the ridge. They are dug in and have machine guns. We cannot move forward until they are silenced." His superiors were skeptical. A strong enemy position in this quiet sector. They ordered him to take the ridge at once. But Stangenberg was cautious. He knew charging across open ground would mean heavy losses. He sent small groups forward, trying to probe for weak points. Each was repelled with deadly accuracy. By noon, frustration had turned into disbelief. In later interviews, captured German soldiers described their amazement at the accuracy of American fire. Private Ernst Kuhn, a paratrooper from the 2nd Company, remembered, "Every time we showed our heads, they shot. They did not waste bullets. They waited for us to move. It was like being hunted by ghosts." Another soldier, Wilhelm Gertner, said, "We thought it was a whole company, maybe even tanks behind them. We heard machine guns from 3 places. When we finally took the position, we could not believe it was so few." The psychological effect was devastating. Rumors spread quickly that American snipers were everywhere. Some men refused to move until ordered at gunpoint. The paratroopers were elite, but they were still human. And on that cold December day, they faced something they couldn't understand: courage that defied logic. The villagers of Lanzerath watched the battle unfold from their homes. Many had lived under German occupation before the Americans arrived, and now they saw the war returning once more. An elderly Belgian farmer, Henri Klinkenberg, later recalled, "The Americans were in the trees above the village. The Germans came from the east. For hours we heard nothing but gunfire and explosions. The ground shook. We did not dare go outside." When the shooting finally stopped, the villagers saw dozens of German bodies scattered across the snow. They were shocked. The Americans who had held that ridge were just boys. Klinkenberg remembered seeing one captured American carried through the village, his face pale and lips blue from the cold. He whispered to another prisoner, "Did we stop them?" The other man nodded. By 2 p.m., Stangenberg's headquarters was in chaos. His battalion was supposed to be several miles west by now, linking up with the 12th SS Panzer Division. Instead, they were stuck in a fight with what appeared to be a phantom enemy. He ordered a full-scale assault with mortar support. Rounds exploded on the ridge, tearing apart trees and foxholes. But when his men advanced again, they were still met with gunfire. A lieutenant reported back in disbelief, "The Americans are still there. They are everywhere and nowhere." In truth, Bouck's men had been firing carefully, moving between positions to confuse the Germans. Their training as reconnaissance troops, sneaky, mobile, observant, allowed them to fight far above their weight. From Stangenberg's perspective, it looked like a coordinated defense by at least a company. He began to wonder if he had stumbled into a major Allied strong point. By late afternoon, morale in the German ranks was deteriorating. Snow and exhaustion set in. The men were cold, hungry, and increasingly doubtful of their mission. They had been told the Americans were weak, poorly trained, quick to surrender. But at Lanzerath, they saw something entirely different. Private Hermann Wöhler recalled, "We thought the Americans would run. Instead, they stayed and fought until the last bullet." It made us wonder how far we would get if every village was like this. In the darkening forest, soldiers huddled behind fences and ditches, waiting for nightfall. Some sharpened bayonets. Others lit cigarettes with trembling hands. They were preparing for another attack, but the sense of easy victory was gone. At 6 p.m., Stangenberg ordered one last assault. The attack would take place under cover of darkness. He believed the Americans were nearly out of ammunition. The paratroopers crept forward, whispering commands. They could see muzzle flashes up the slope like lightning in the fog. Grenades exploded among the trees. When they finally reached the ridge, they discovered empty foxholes and small clusters of resistance. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out. It was chaotic, brutal, and fast. By 8 p.m., it was over. The surviving Americans had been captured or wounded. The ridge, at last, belonged to the Germans. But Stangenberg's victory felt hollow. He had lost too many men. And worse, he had lost time. While the Germans struggled at Lanzerath, American commanders further west were reacting. The delay allowed the 2nd Infantry Division and 99th Division reinforcements to establish defensive lines on the Elsenborn Ridge, one of the most critical positions in the Ardennes. When the SS tanks of Kampfgruppe Piper reached the area the next day, they found strong defenses waiting. The narrow roads were clogged with vehicles and wrecks. The element of surprise was gone. Military historians later concluded that the delay caused by Bouck's platoon directly contributed to the failure of Piper's advance. What was supposed to be a lightning strike became a slow grind through resistance that grew stronger every hour. Years after the war, Major Stangenberg was interviewed about the battle. He spoke candidly about his shock that day. "We were told the American line was thin. We believed it. But those men on the ridge, they were something else. They fought like an entire regiment. I never forgot them." He admitted that the resistance at Lanzerath had caused confusion throughout his chain of command. His regiment spent the night reorganizing instead of pressing forward. By the next morning, their schedule was already broken, and the momentum of the offensive began to slip away. When the battle ended, the Americans were taken prisoner. But the Germans, too, suffered casualties that led to later captures. Some of these German POWs, interrogated weeks later, spoke of the bewildering fight. One said, "We thought we were fighting an entire company. When I learned later it was less than 20 men, I felt embarrassed, but also I respected them." Another admitted, "They shot at us like hunters. Calm, precise, always waiting for the right moment. It made us afraid to move." These testimonies, collected by Allied intelligence, revealed a striking truth: that even the enemy viewed the American stand as something extraordinary. The story of Lanzerath Ridge spread quickly among German units in the area. Rumors grew exaggerated. Some claimed an entire division had been wiped out by a handful of Americans. Others said the defenders had called in artillery from miles away. Regardless of the details, the legend spread fear and hesitation. Many soldiers began to believe that American troops were far more dangerous than propaganda had told them. It was a small but crucial shift in morale, one that rippled through the German ranks as the Battle of the Bulge dragged on. For Lieutenant Bouck and his men, the ordeal didn't end with surrender. They were marched under guard through the snow, past the very field where so many Germans had fallen. Some captors nodded respectfully, others stared silently. A few even saluted the young lieutenant. The Americans were taken first to a farmhouse for interrogation, then sent by truck to prisoner camps deeper inside Germany. They were hungry, cold, and still in shock. Private Sam Jenkins later recalled, "The Germans looked at us like they couldn't believe what they were seeing." One officer asked, "How many were you?" I said, 18. He shook his head and said, "Unmöglich, impossible." The captured Americans were eventually taken to Stalag 13D near Nuremberg. Conditions were harsh: little food, constant cold, and overcrowded barracks. Still, even among their guards, there was a sense of grudging respect. One German officer reportedly told Bouck, "You and your men delayed the Führer's best division. You should be proud." Bouck's reply was modest. "We just did our duty." Inside the camp, word of their stand reached other Allied prisoners. Many thought it was an exaggeration, 18 men holding off a battalion. But those who knew Bouck believed it. Back at Allied headquarters, chaos reigned during the first days of the Bulge. Radio lines were cut, units scattered, and many small battles went unreported. Bouck's platoon was listed as missing in action. No one realized what they had accomplished until much later. Their intelligence logs, detailed notes about German troop movements, were lost when their position was overrun. When the survivors returned months later, few believed their story at first. It sounded impossible. Only after German documents and eyewitness accounts matched their reports did the truth emerge. In the decades after the war, historians began piecing together the full story. Military researcher Alex Kershaw later described Lanzerath as the smallest unit to hold up the largest attack. Official German records confirmed the delay. A report from the 1st SS Panzer Corps noted that the advance near Lanzerath was significantly hindered by unexpected and stubborn resistance. In military terms, the Americans' stand bought roughly 18 hours of time, enough for 2 U.S. divisions to dig in at Elsenborn Ridge. Without that delay, the German drive might have reached the Meuse River before Christmas, potentially changing the course of the entire campaign. For decades, the men of the 394 I&R Platoon received little acknowledgement. Their heroism was buried under the chaos of the war's final months. It wasn't until the late 1970s that survivors began to reconnect and share their memories. A historian named John Eisenhower, the son of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, investigated their story. He confirmed its accuracy and recommended official recognition. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented the platoon with the Presidential Unit Citation. It was one of the few times such an award was given to so small a group. At the ceremony, Bouck, now a quiet insurance salesman in Missouri, stood at attention beside his surviving comrades. Reporters asked him how it felt. He simply said, "We were lucky to be alive. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home." Some German veterans of the Ardennes later spoke openly about the futility of that offensive. They described the shock of facing American forces that refused to break. One paratrooper wrote in his memoir, "We were told the Americans were weak, addicted to comfort and soft living. But on that ridge, I saw men who froze and starved and still would not yield. It was then I knew the war was lost." For many, Lanzerath became a symbol of the broader truth that by late 1944, German courage could no longer overcome the Allies' resolve and coordination. Today, the Lanzerath Ridge remains a quiet, peaceful slope overlooking the Belgian countryside. A small monument stands there, marking the spot where Bouck's platoon made its stand. Visitors see plaques listing the names of those 18 men. Each year, veterans and historians gather to lay wreaths and tell the story again of courage, confusion, and impossible odds. The ridge looks serene now, covered in grass instead of snow. But beneath that calm surface lies the memory of one of the most remarkable small unit actions in World War II. War often remembers grand strategies and famous generals. But sometimes history turns on the actions of a handful of men. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 young Americans faced an army. They didn't retreat. They didn't panic. They stood firm, knowing their sacrifice might buy others a chance to fight another day. From the German side, it was a battle of frustration and disbelief, proof that even the best trained soldiers can be stopped by courage and willpower. In the frozen woods of the Ardennes, For 18 hours, two worlds collided. And from that collision came one of the greatest underdog stories of the Second World War. When the war ended in May 1945, the survivors of the 394th I&R Platoon returned home quietly. They were thinner, paler, older than their years. Each man carried private memories of the ridge, the biting cold, the ringing of gunfire, the faces of friends lost. No parades greeted them. There were no newspaper stories, no medals waiting. The world had moved on to victory celebrations and reconstruction. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr. went back to St. Louis. He finished college, married his sweetheart, and became an insurance salesman. For decades, he spoke little about the war. Even his children didn't know what he had done. Many of his men followed similar paths. They built families, careers, and quiet lives, the ordinary peace they had fought so hard to protect. But history has a way of remembering those who never asked for recognition. For nearly 30 years, the story of the Lanzerath stand remained buried in military archives. Occasional references appeared in unit reports, but few people understood its scale. Then in the 1970s, a handful of researchers and veterans began piecing the puzzle together. One of them was John Eisenhower, a military historian and son of the Allied Supreme Commander. While writing about the Battle of the Bulge, he stumbled across after-action reports mentioning an unknown platoon that had delayed the German advance for an entire day. Eisenhower tracked down surviving members of the 99th Division and interviewed them. What he found astonished him. He later wrote, "The action at Lanzerath was one of the most outstanding small unit defenses of World War II. It deserves to be studied as a model of courage, discipline, and tactical ingenuity." His work brought long overdue recognition to the 18 young Americans who had defied impossible odds. To understand why the platoon's stand was so effective, one must look at the terrain itself. The Lanzerath Ridge rises gently above a shallow valley with a road cutting through the center toward the village. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the ground was frozen hard, covered with 6 inches of snow. Bouck's men dug their foxholes into a tree line just below the crest, not directly on top, but slightly back, giving them a clear line of sight without exposing themselves. The slope in front of them was open ground, a death trap for anyone advancing uphill. When the German paratroopers entered that field, they had nowhere to hide. Every movement was visible. Every mistake was punished. Military analysts later described it as a perfect natural defense point. Bouck hadn't chosen it by luck. He had spent days studying maps and surveying the ridge. His decision to dig in there turned the ridge into a fortress of snow and pine. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon wasn't designed to hold ground. Its primary mission was to scout, report, and withdraw before being detected. But Bouck's leadership transformed those skills into an advantage. He organized his men into small fire teams, each with overlapping fields of fire. He placed his only machine gun in the center, supported by riflemen on both flanks. When the Germans attacked, the platoon shifted positions subtly, making it appear as if there were more defenders. This tactic, known as fluid defense, confused the attackers. The Germans couldn't determine the Americans' strength or exact location. They fired at ghosts Bouck also ordered strict fire discipline. No one fired without a clear target. Every bullet was meant to count. That precision created the illusion of overwhelming firepower. In a post-war analysis, U.S. Army historians noted, the platoon's controlled fields of fire and movement deception techniques amplified their combat power tenfold. 18 men had fought like 100. The difference in how each side recorded the battle is striking. The German 1st SS Panzer Corps logged the Lanzerath encounter as unexpected American resistance, causing 18-hour delay. They estimated the defending force at 1 reinforced company. In contrast, U.S. records initially listed Bouck's platoon as missing in action. Their unit was never reported as engaged in major combat. Only after POW debriefings and captured German documents did the truth emerge. It was a textbook case of how chaos distorts history. Even within the same battle, truth can vanish under confusion and fog. In interviews decades later, Bouck spoke humbly about the ordeal. He never called himself a hero. He often said, "We just did what any soldiers would have done." But those who served under him remembered differently. Sergeant William Slape, the platoon marksman, said, "Bouck never lost his head. He crawled through gunfire to check our positions, made sure we had ammo, and kept us focused. He was only 20, but he had the calm of an old sergeant." Bouck's leadership was quiet but decisive. He made tactical calls based on instinct and observation, not emotion. When radio contact failed, he improvised. When ammunition ran low, he reorganized his line. He kept morale alive in an impossible situation. Military analysts later used his decisions as examples in officer training programs, especially his use of terrain, camouflage, and timing. After the war, when reporters finally began asking Bouck about Lanzerath, he often downplayed it. He would smile and say, "It wasn't that big a deal. We were just doing our job." In reality, his modesty nearly erased his platoon's place in history. It was only through the persistence of his men, especially Sergeant Sam Jenkins and Corporal Preston, that the story reached the public. They wrote letters to military historians, describing the fight in detail. When their letters reached the Pentagon archives, researchers compared them with German battle logs. Everything matched. By the 1980s, the story was no longer a rumor. It was an official part of U.S. military history. On October 26, 1981, in a bright hall at the Pentagon, the surviving members of the 394th I&R Platoon stood together once more. Most were in their 50s and 60s now, gray-haired, wearing neatly pressed suits instead of uniforms. The U.S. Army Band played softly as the Secretary of the Army read the citation aloud for extraordinary heroism and outstanding performance of duty in action against the enemy. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment distinguished itself by holding off a vastly superior enemy force for more than 18 hours. When the applause began, Bouck looked around at the faces of his old comrades. Some smiled, others wiped their eyes. For the first time in nearly 40 years, their courage was fully recognized. Later, President Ronald Reagan personally met with Bouck. He told him, "You and your men showed the spirit that saved Europe." Bouck reportedly answered, "Sir, we were just trying to stay alive." It was the same humility that had defined his leadership in 1944. Historians now agree that the delay at Lanzerath had direct operational consequences. Had Stangenberg's battalion advanced as planned, it would have linked up with Kampfgruppe Piper several hours earlier. That connection might have allowed Piper's armoured column to seize fuel depots at Stavelot and Spa, two vital supply centres for the Allies. Without fuel, Piper's tanks later stalled, abandoned in snowy fields as the German offensive collapsed. The domino effect began on the ridge at Lanzerath. 18 men had disrupted the timetable of an entire army. Modern military academies, including West Point and Sandhurst, study the Battle of Lanzerath as an example of force multiplication through tactics and morale. The key lessons include use of terrain. Bouck positioned his platoon below the crest for concealment and defensive advantage. Economy of fire. Every shot was deliberate, maximizing psychological impact. Deception and movement. Constant repositioning gave the illusion of larger numbers. Leadership under stress. Calm, decentralized command structure kept morale steady. These lessons are now part of leadership training worldwide. They show how initiative and intelligence can outweigh sheer numbers. In military seminars, instructors often ask, if you were one of those 18 men, what would you have done? It remains a question without an easy answer. Decades after the war, the German Federal Archives declassified operational reports from the Ardennes offensive. Among them were post-action notes from Fallschirmjäger Regiment 9. One entry, written in December 1944, read, "Enemy resistance near Lanzerath unexpectedly strong. Estimated company size. High accuracy of fire. Terrain unfavorable. Casualties significant." Another, added weeks later by the regimental adjutant, concluded, "Delays on the 16th of December contributed to failure of link-up with armoured elements, resistance disproportionate to expected strength, tactical surprise by enemy patrol." In plain language, the German army admitted that a small American patrol had disrupted an entire operational schedule. Even today, German military historians view Lanzerath as an example of how misjudging enemy morale can doom an offensive. Some of the most poignant records of the battle come from personal diaries. A German soldier named Friedrich Heller, who fought under Stangenberg, wrote in his notebook, "We attacked again and again, always the same fire, always from nowhere. My friend Karl fell beside me. I do not understand how such few men can fight like this. They must be mad, or heroes." From the American side, Private Robert "Buddy" Milburn wrote home after the war, "We were scared every second, but nobody wanted to be the first to leave. I remember thinking, if we run, the next guys get hit instead. So we stayed. We just stayed." Two young men on opposite sides, each trying to make sense of the same storm. Their words remind us that war, at its heart, is not about armies, but about individuals. The rediscovery of Lanzerath Ridge came at a time when America was re-evaluating its history during the 1970s and 80s after Vietnam. The story of 18 ordinary soldiers standing firm against overwhelming odds resonated deeply. It became a symbol of grit, integrity, and moral clarity, values Americans wanted to believe in again. Documentaries and books soon followed. The story appeared in military journals, high school history classes, and even leadership seminars for corporate teams. It became a parable of determination under pressure. One commentator wrote, Lanzerath reminds us that true strength doesn't come from numbers, but from conviction. In a world weary of grand wars and politics, the small stand on a frozen ridge became a human story that everyone could understand. In Germany, the battle was remembered differently. For years, the focus after 1945 was on rebuilding, not reliving. Many veterans avoided speaking about the Ardennes campaign, which symbolized the final desperate months of Nazi Germany. But by the 1990s, younger German historians began revisiting these battles, not to glorify them, but to understand. They interviewed surviving paratroopers, including those who had fought at Lanzerath. The veterans expressed both admiration and sorrow. One said, "We respected those Americans. They fought like lions, but we all lost something that day, our youth, our illusions, our future." At memorial events in Belgium, German and American veterans sometimes met, shook hands, and shared quiet conversations. In those moments, the ridge became not just a battlefield, but a bridge of understanding. If you visit Lanzerath, Belgium, today, you'll find a peaceful landscape. A narrow road winds through the village. Cows graze on rolling hills. The air smells of pine and wet grass. At the top of the ridge stands a modest stone monument. It bears the names of the 18 men of the 394th I&R Platoon and the inscription, "To those who held the line." Local residents still remember the story. Every December, wreaths appear at the memorial, placed by Belgian families, American tourists, and even German visitors. The snow still falls on that slope each winter, quietly covering the ground where courage once echoed. Modern historians see the Lanzerath stand as a microcosm of the larger war, a contest not just of armies, but of human will. Military historian Stephen Ambrose once described it as proof that leadership and morale can alter the course of battle, even when the math says otherwise. At West Point, cadets study Bouck's decisions, not as luck, but as leadership. They analyze the ridge's layout, the fields of fire, and the timing of German movements. Every inch of that snowy hillside has become a lesson. Yet despite the tactical brilliance, veterans always return to one simple truth. It was courage, raw, quiet courage, that made it possible. Before his death in 2016, Lyle Bouck gave one of his last interviews to a military history magazine. He was asked what he remembered most about that day. He paused for a long moment before answering. "I remember the cold, the fear, the snow in our mouths when we hit the ground. But mostly, I remember the faces of my men. They never gave up, not once. That's what I think about. Not the battle, not the medals, just the men." His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes stayed firm. The interviewer later wrote that it was like speaking to someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity, and chose to remember the best. The story of Lanzerath Ridge lives on because it speaks to something timeless. It tells us that courage isn't measured by victory, but by perseverance. That leadership isn't about orders, but about belief, and that even in the darkest hours, the light of human will can hold back the storm. On that winter morning in 1944, 18 young Americans faced a force 20 times their size. They fought with discipline, ingenuity, and faith in one another. They did not break. They did not flee. They stood, and history stood with them. Today, the wind still whispers through the pines above Lanzerath. If you listen closely, you might hear the faint echo of their rifles and the quiet heartbeat of courage that refused to die.